given that the housing market is such a sentiment-driven market, I think the information we get on what businesses and consumer think from something like the Pulse survey is very important. I'm also very conscious that I'm the last stand between you and your lunch. So the good news is when you have one economist after another, we tend to duplicate each other in some of the slides. So I'll try and rattle through it fairly quickly. Where I'm coming from on this is Property Industry Ireland. I just put this up here to reflect the point that our members come from across the sector. So our views reflect the broad range of planners, architects, designers, funders, estate agents, and that. I think also we've heard a lot about and we've seen a lot about the housing market being in crisis. I think there are a lot of challenges there, not least how do you intervene in a market that's out of balance? How do you intervene to help a market and to get it back to a sustainable point when it's out of balance? The Minister, when he was talking this morning, talked about implementation, and I think that's going to be a key thing. Who implements the National Planning Framework? Who implements the National Development Plan? We have a lot of policies, but who implements them in a meaningful way to address the issues that exist? And I think one of the other things that it's incumbent upon us all to recognise, and Loretta touched upon this, is just that we are operating in a new environment. And I think a ready example of that is the credit environment, where there's a different credit situation for on the wholesale side, should we say, on the developer side, where you're looking at debt equity now rather than previously just debt, but also on the demand side you're looking at a different credit world where there are the macroprudential rules in place, and that's going to be the environment in which the economy and the housing market go forward. I also think that it's worth making the point that there isn't just one solution. The housing market is a very complex market. There are different interests, different stakeholders, different needs, first-time buyers, repeat buyers, social housing, owner-occupancy, the rental market, macroprudential rules, a whole host of things all interacting, and how they might interact upon supply and the decision to develop and viability and the cost of construction. So a very complex market, many of the elements are interlinked, and I don't actually think there is one silver bullet. I think there are a range of measures that need to be taken. And I suppose that's why I've got a circle there. They're not prioritised, but these all interact with each other, and these are some of the things that I think do need to be addressed in order to these are some of the challenges and issues that face the market and need to be addressed in order to get the market back to a stable situation. Loretta showed us the charts on prices and rents and the changes there, and we're seeing prices and rents go up by 8 to 10%. And I think we need to understand what's causing that. There has been some talk about there being a bubble, and I think that's probably a concern because I think this is different to the previous situation. It's being driven by supply issues and I suppose what you could call fundamental issues rather than credit. But having said that, I think one of the things we should learn from the crash is that we shouldn't talk about this time it being different. And also, if there are concerns, I think we need to look at them, even to understand what's driving them and to get a sense of what impact they might have on the economy. So if things are being flagged, if people are expressing a concern that there's a bubble, well then maybe look at it and understand what's driving it. So as I say, be vigilant. Personally, I think what is driving a lot of what's happening at the moment is that growth in supply lagging behind the growth in demand. Loretta talked about 35 to 40,000 new households being formed each year at a time when the measures of housing supply suggest that we're delivering anything between 10 and 20,000 units into the market. So that there is that huge supply-demand imbalance that needs to be addressed. But I think given that we're seeing that demand, given that we're seeing prices and rents go up, why is the supply not coming through to the market? And I think one of the things that I took away from Loretta's presentation was some of the things that builders expressed as concern. And one of the key ones there for me was just that policy uncertainty, that changing of policy causing development to stop and start. And I think that's really important. I have it there as well as policy certainty needed. I actually also think that while I had a slide earlier showing newspaper headlines showing talking about a housing crisis, I actually think that there does need to be within policy circles maybe more of a recognition of the fact that this is a crisis. There are a lot of policies, but unfortunately there are a lot of working groups. That causes stop-start. I mean, if we are talking about a housing market crisis, then I think we need to have some urgency in policy implementation. And I also think that what we're seeing now in many ways is a repeat of some of the things that happened during the boom, but housing being much more linked to competitiveness. We're talking about opportunities arising from Brexit, but in many ways our ability to avail of those opportunities is being curtailed by the housing market. And we've seen both the National Competitiveness Council and the National Risk Assessment both highlight the availability and affordability of housing, affordability across both owner occupancy and rental, as being a major risk to our competitiveness. So resolving the housing market issue, I think, is an economy issue, actually, rather than just a housing market issue. You've seen, this is the same graph, essentially, that Loretta used, taking the ESB connections as our proxy measure for completions. Again, I think just one of the issues that we need to be careful of is there's a huge focus on new build as being the solution to the problem. And undoubtedly, like many of the things that we've seen, it plays a role. New build will deliver new housing into the market, but that will only represent a small proportion of the overall housing stock. And I think what we need to do is look at other ways of getting the existing stock into the market. I think apartment viability is a huge issue. Underutilized stock, and what are the barriers there? What are the barriers to mobility within the second-hand market that would allow that stock that's being underutilized to come into the market? Can we do more on living over the shop and living in the city? Can things be done to utilize what's there already and get that into the market? So all of these things, I'm not downplaying new build, but I think that we've got to look at the entire market and look at a variety of solutions. I think also, and it came up actually in Carl Dieter's talk this morning, one of the key things is affordability. This just shows the annual change in prices and rents. And as I say, we're seeing them run at about 8 to 10% per annum at a time when incomes are not growing by 8 to 10% per annum. So you've got an affordability issue there, which I think is really important. And I think what also struck me about this is that it's not impacting on everybody. If you look at the extreme right-hand column, about 60% of those who are renting are aged under 40. So going back to the population graph that Loretta had, in those key household formation age groups, a lot of people are renting, they're facing rents going up by 10% and house prices going up by 10%. So that saving it for a deposit is a key issue. So the impact of these changes, it's impacting on some cohorts of the economy more than others, and how do we deal with that, I think, is how do we address that affordability issue, I think is a really key challenge. The availability of labour has been talked about before. What I've put here is both the overall market but also the employment in construction, and really the point I want to make here is that while we've seen overall employment return to close to the peak, we haven't seen that in construction. The fall there from the peak to the trough in the orange line is somewhere in the order of 160,000. The recovery is in the order of 50,000. So where have those workers gone? The central bank recently released a research note on this, which looked at the labour force data that the CSO produced. It doesn't see a large pool of unemployed construction workers. It doesn't see a large pool of construction workers who have left the labour force or who are inactive, who could be brought back into the labour force. And what they say it points to is a lot of emigration among those who were in the construction sector. So in terms of getting the resources, there aren't necessarily readily available pools of underutilized construction workers within the economy. So how do we attract people back to work in the sector? One of the ways we do that is to make it a more stable and sustainable sector. I think and this would be economy-wide, but I think the kind of the scarring of the economy from the crash and the extent of the decline in activity across the economy, but particularly in the construction sector, has coloured people's view of the sector as a career option, and I think that's a real challenge for the sector. I can rattle through this fairly quickly because Loretta covered it, but we saw a stabilisation in the average household size. Again, what's driving that? Is that behaviour? Is it economic factors? Is it a combination of the two? Again, on the period that's covered there, that's just coming out of the crash. We were still talking about widespread mortgage arrears. We were still talking about widespread negative equity. People's perception of going out and buying their own home will have been changed by the crash. And I think the fact that we've seen the increase in the numbers renting, I think that, and the Minister touched on it this morning, but we do need to develop a rental sector where it is a long-run viable option for people to rent. It's a stable sector. It's part of our FDI culture as well. People coming in who maybe are only living in Ireland for 4 or 5 years. They want to rent, but they don't want to buy. So I do think that the measures to develop the rental sector are hugely important. We've seen the SCSI report point to the challenges in the viability of construction of apartments. But I also think it's important that not only do we look at new construction coming into the residential sector and new funding in terms of institutional funding, but the scale of that means that in many ways it's Dublin and a couple of the other urban centres that are attractive. But we do need to maintain the existing stock of rental property for rural and regional Ireland. So the tax treatment of rental income, I think, is particularly important. We need to maintain the existing rental stock that we've got. There's conflicting evidence on this, but a couple of the agents do say that if you look at their sales, there's a net outflow of small-scale landlords from the sector. Some of that will be soaked up in the urban centres by institutional investors, but in the rest of the country, they play a very, very important role. I also think that we need to build more social housing. I think that's really important, building more social housing. I think building is important rather than the government going into the market and competing with first-time buyers and other buyers for properties. I think building direct new build is a really important part of the solution. We've talked a lot about the national planning framework. Again, the fact that we're thinking about what the economy will look like in 2040 and what we need to put in place to allow that kind of development take place is hugely, hugely important. I worked for a long time as an economic forecaster, so I know that more often than not your forecasts are wrong. But I think the fact that we're actually taking a stab at it and we're thinking about the kind of issues that need to be addressed to allow the economy, the housing market and society to develop, I think they're really, really important. A lot of these issues have been touched on already this morning, so I won't dwell on them. But I mean, preventing urban sprawl, making better use of our existing housing stock, making better use of our urban centres, and using and interacting that better use with the more efficient use of our infrastructure, but also putting in place the infrastructure to allow the more efficient use. I drove down here this morning from Dublin, and just the volume of traffic going in on the other side of the motorway that's not sustainable. I saw somewhere that the M50 is now at the projected 2023 levels. We can't keep overusing our infrastructure like that. We need to put in place the infrastructure that allows us to operate as a modern developed economy, but also to use our city spaces more efficiently. I don't think there is a single reform. As I mentioned, I think there are a variety of reforms. Also, I think the SCSI report on apartment building also looked at a variety of options and found any one thing on its own, yes, it can make a positive difference, but it will only make a small difference. So we're not trying to find one solution, we're trying to find a number of solutions that work together. I do think supply is important. And a functioning mortgage market, so that you do get that mobility within the existing market. And I do think we also need to have a whole of government approach, because I think we've seen, and there are dangers, that a very good policy on one side of the market can have unintended consequences on the other. And to recognize that in a market like the housing market, where there are so many different players, actors, interconnections, that intervening on one side can have an impact on the other. For example, a very quick example, the macroprudential rules are really, really good idea, a really good policy tool to protect the banking system. But when they came into being, because there was some concern about the impact of those on demand, that actually slowed down the supply coming into the market, because developers or home builders were concerned about whether there would be the demand. So you have a very good policy on one side, but it does flow through into other sides of the market. And I think we just need to recognize that and have an understanding of how they interact. So I think the supply issue is going to continue to dominate residential, both on the owner occupancy and the rental side. And I think they both have a role in the market, and they both need to be addressed. We are seeing a supply response happening, and I think the Minister talked about the central bank forecast for the increase in housing output over the next couple of years. But the reality is, it does take time to deliver new housing. You know, you're looking at a 18-month, 2-year new build, or build time. So yes, it is being addressed, but we are looking at a short-term squeeze. And the trouble is that on the demographics, you're looking at 35,000 new households. Take account of the pent-up demand. You're probably looking at a need for 45 to 50,000 units in the short term, while that pent-up demand is being addressed. I think the National Development Plan and the National Planning Framework are really good documents. They're also good because they're taking a longer-term view. They're taking a 10-year view. They're taking a view out to 2040. But it just points to the resource issue that we're looking at here in the sector. The sector is already experiencing resource constraints. We're looking to increase the number of houses built. We're looking at a huge national development plan to put in place infrastructure, the children's hospital, etc., etc., etc. We're also looking at private sector investment continuing on the retail, the commercial, the leisure side. So those resources, where are they going to come from to deliver all that? And as I said, one of the things that struck me in the past 2 years in terms of the discussion about housing is just the way it's now being seen as an all-economy issue in terms of competitiveness, not only in terms of its cost, but increasingly in terms of its availability. And the good news is, that's it. Thanks very much.